Thank you all for coming, especially those of you who are here on a completely voluntary basis. I'm Todd Garth. I'll make this introduction very brief. I'm Todd Garth. I teach Spanish in the Languages and Cultures Department. I'm also the director of the Forum for Latin American Studies trainings I sent out a few emails. Say thank you for coming. This lecture is made possible, of course, by the Center for Regional Studies. This is actually our second visit from a Georgetown professor who's giving a talk on Brazil, which is a good thing because it's a country we all need to know more about. This is an area that West Point can truly say they have, they can hold over us. So maybe if we keep this up, we can someday actually make a credible challenge to our movement. Professor Bryan McCann is Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University. That's a little misleading because his area of expertise is contemporary Brazil. And within that field, his breadth of knowledge is rather astonishing. He's written books and articles on such a wide range of topics as the Brazilian experience with democracy since the end of the last military government 40 years ago. That was one book. Popular music in Brazilian culture, modern Brazilian culture. That was another book, a prize-winning book. A book, an edited volume on the culture of informality in Latin American cities. And a forthcoming book on the culture and society of Rio de Janeiro's infamous Favelas. It's one name. He's written on Brazilian women's volleyball, which is something that sports enthusiasts don't pay nearly enough attention to. He's written on the Brazilian slave experience, on the role of radio in popular Brazilian culture. He's interested in general in the history of ideas in contemporary Brazil, so you can see quite a range of topics. Today, Dr. McCann is going to talk about something that fascinates me personally. I know just enough about Rio de Janeiro and its dysfunctions to make me dangerous, so he's the man to listen to. And hopefully he will educate me as well as you on Rio's preparations to host the 2016 Summer Olympics. I'm all ears. Please give a warm name welcome to Professor Bryan McCann.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Mark, so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you today. Such a beautiful campus and such a distinguished institution. I really feel honored to be invited. And as you can guess from what Todd was saying, I just love Brazil. So anything Brazilian, I tend to get interested in it and often start researching it and do a little bit of writing. And there are some topics where I really develop a passionate interest and do a lot of profound work on it. Well, profound might be exaggeration, but a lot of extensive work on it. For example, with the history of favelas, self-built squatter settlements in Rio, and others that I treat more briefly, but try to have something interesting to say about it as well. So today's topic on the Olympics in Rio is a little bit of a combination of those. I've lived in Rio for 6 or 7 years, and I've done extensive research on the history of the city, particularly the history of the city over the past 50 years, and the history of urban planning in Rio, and the history of inequality, and of the favelas, and of urban violence. And so I've been keeping a close eye on the preparation for the Olympics with all that in mind to try to see how it is going to change the city of Rio. And so my interest in it mainly comes from that perspective. How are the Olympics changing Rio? Not so much whether Rio will put on a successful Olympics. So let me address that division right now and say that there are two divergent perspectives on this that I want to hold at the same time. And one of these is that as a spectacle and as a sporting event, the 2016 Summer Olympics in Rio will be successful. Rio is exceptionally good at putting on large events, and particularly large, spectacular, and celebratory events. The annual carnival celebration in Rio is billed as the world's biggest party with some justification. And putting on the carnival and putting on the Olympics are not actually as different as you might guess, given that one is a sporting or a series of sporting events and the other is basically an enormous party. Both of them involve moving people across the city and hosting massive events and trying to maintain security and some semblance of organization through that. Now, at Carnival, it actually helps if everybody is drunk, and that's generally the way it's done. At the Olympics, only the spectators will be drunk, but still, the basic logistics are similar. So when it comes to actually putting on the event, I don't foresee major problems, so I'm not panicking in that regard. But the other perspective is, what does this mean for urban planning in Rio? What does this mean for social inclusion in Rio? What does this mean for the environment in Rio? I'm much less positive on all of those. So I want to put your fears to rest if you think the Olympics are going to be a disaster as an event. No, in that regard, I think they'll be very successful. But I might be confirming your fears and hesitations by saying that the Olympics are not going to leave the positive legacy that it initially seemed like they might, and that there's a lot of unfortunate things that are going on to prepare for the Olympics. So the photograph you see on the screen is a photograph of children in a favela, in one of these communities that's built by the people who live there. They build their homes themselves and add on to them year after year after year to try to improve them. And they have no property title, and so they have no legal right to dwell on this land, but they have the customary right that comes with decades of residence there. And over time, these have become very much part of the city. They are not marginal to the city. They're a crucial part of the city. At least 20% of the city lives in favelas, these self-built squatter settlements. And as you can see, they're very urban, they're very built up. They are what we say in the field is consolidated. These are consolidated urban neighborhoods, but they're not formal because they have no formal property title, and they are not planned by professionals. They're not designed by architects. They're not built by professional construction firms. So they are informal urban settlement. But sports are very popular in these urban informal settlements. So some of the images I'm showing to you will be of people playing sports in the informal urban settlements as a kind of contrast between that and the preparation for the Olympics. And most of these photographs are by a friend of mine who's from one of the favelas in Rio and who's a great professional photographer, which is also a curiosity. It shows you that these are not marginal and impoverished neighborhoods necessary. No, they have a tremendous amount of economic diversity within them, to the point where you can have a very distinguished professional photographer who has grown up and continues to live in one of the most notorious favelas in terms of urban violence, which is the Complexo da Maré. It happens to be the favela that is closest to the international airport. It basically is right next to the international airport. So anybody flying into Rio for the Olympics will be taking a bus or driving right down the highway that runs right alongside this favela. So favela residents have been justifiably uncomfortable about the impending Olympics for 10 years now, or at least 8 years now. They've known that this is going to have a dramatic effect on their lives, as indeed it is happening. And so much of my talk will concentrate on that. What do the Olympics mean for the less fortunate residents of Rio, the residents of these favelas? How are they benefiting or not benefiting? At the same time, now we have a new problem, right? You've all heard of Zika virus. This is something that nobody was planning for, this threat. It has emerged since the 2014 World Cup, and it's really only become publicly acknowledged in the past 8 months, I would say, in Brazil. It became clear about a year ago that there was an apparent link between the Zika virus itself and the growing number of microcephaly cases that was emerging, particularly in northeastern Brazil, not so much in Rio de Janeiro itself, but some of them in Rio de Janeiro itself. And there's speculation that seems to be supported by the evidence that this really started to spread either with the World Cup in 2014 or with an international canoeing event shortly after the World Cup, both of which brought a lot of international travelers and spectators and may have helped spread the Zika virus from the South Seas to Brazil. And now it's spreading throughout Brazil and through much of Latin America. And so there is tremendous fear, not necessarily panic about the Zika virus and its purported, but it seems to be highly probable link to microcephaly in Brazil. Now there's a more recent understanding that it also seems to be linked to Guillain-Barré syndrome, which tends to produce temporary paralysis and can lead to mortal complications. People suffering from Guillain-Barré then can also have difficulty breathing, and many of them die as a result. So we know that Zika virus, or at least we strongly believe that Zika virus is linked to risk of microcephaly and therefore is a tremendous danger for pregnant women or women who are planning to become pregnant or think that they might be becoming pregnant anytime in the near future. But it now does probably pose this wider risk. And so there are legitimate fears about Zika virus. And so now Rio faces a much greater planning challenge than it faced even a year ago. It already had enough challenges a year ago. Now on top of that, it has to prepare to deal with Zika virus. And so this slide shows workers in downtown Rio in what's known as the Sambadrome, which is where they hold the main annual carnival parade of samba schools or samba bands that parades through downtown Rio and ends in this Sambadrome. So they're carrying out fumigation, and fumigation will be executed on a massive, probably unprecedented scale in Rio as the Olympics approach. It's not enough. We understand that fumigation is not enough. There has to be much more extensive kinds of mosquito control, even to diminish the risks temporarily. Now, to its credit, Rio has done this before. Rio has, in its history, carried out some of the most successful mosquito control programs. Those were 112 years ago, when Rio first attacked mosquito-borne viruses. At that point, the city was very small. But I just want to call to mind that Rio does have, in fact, an illustrious public health history. This is not a completely unprepared third world city. No, it is a highly developed city. Brazil has a first world public health complex. That said, it also has tremendous inequality, which complicates any public health strategy. So there'll be a massive effort to eliminate mosquitoes and reduce risk of transmission of Zika virus. And it will be drastically reduced, but there's no way to reduce it to zero. One mitigating factor is that the Olympics will happen in our summer, but they happen in the winter of Rio de Janeiro, when the mosquito risk is massively reduced simply because of seasonal transitions. There is still a mosquito population in the southern hemisphere winter, and so that in itself will not take care of this problem the way it would around here, for example, but it at least makes it a little easier to deal with during the winter in Rio de Janeiro. All right, let me show you a few more slides of what Rio de Janeiro looks like and what favelas in Rio de Janeiro look like. Here's another, this is a strikingly beautiful image of a favela in Rio de Janeiro, right? And it shows us that these are underprivileged, underserved neighborhoods, but they are not destitute neighborhoods, and that they have their own cultural vitality. This gives you a sense of life in the favela, a sense of the density, a typical alleyway in this favela of Maré, incredibly crowded living conditions, and these are going to tend to facilitate mosquito reproduction. You have a lot of stagnant water. Here's an image of the public life in one of the favelas in Rio. It is a celebratory public environment in general in the favelas and in the rest of the city. It's a tremendously violent city, as you've no doubt heard, but it's also a very celebratory city. And sports are extraordinarily popular across classes. And so this is one of the things that Rio had going for it in the bid for the Olympics, and that will help it put on a successful event despite some of these challenges. People who live in Rio tend to love sports. They'll be enthusiastic about the sporting events. Most of them will not be able to afford tickets, so they'll only be able to see things like the open water swim or the marathon or some of the boating events. Nonetheless, there will be celebration going on. If there's a party, if there's a sporting event, people will be celebrating it. Here's another image of popular sports in Rio. There's nothing like the ping pong at the Olympic level that's going to be happening, or sorry, the table tennis that's going to be happening at the Olympics. But gives you a sense of, yeah, this is what public life in the favelas is like. It's dense, it's overcrowded, it's economically disadvantaged, but by no means impoverished, by no means destitute. Here's another image of popular sports in the favela where boxing is taking off as a popular pastime. And it reminds us perhaps of some of the diversification that's happened in Rio de Janeiro and in the rest of Brazil over the last generation. You probably think of Brazil as the land of soccer, or of what the rest of the world calls football. Unfortunately, perhaps not so much anymore. Brazil hasn't done as well on the international stage in soccer, but it tends to be doing very well. And for example, Todd mentioned volleyball. Brazil has actually been much more dominant in volleyball over the past generation than it has been in soccer. Popular sports have also diversified in Brazil over the past generation. And so kids growing up in the favela, they're not just playing soccer. Some of them will be, of course, but lots of them will be doing things like boxing or basketball or skateboarding, for example, we'll see, or dozens of other possibilities. And there is at least one resident of the favelas in Rio who still has a shot, an outside shot, of making the Olympic teams as a beach volleyball player. Probably not going to happen, but it shows that there is this chance, this aspiration still does exist. Here's a more typical image, children in the favelas playing soccer. That's the kind of thing you could have seen a generation ago, where some of these others are a sign of growing diversification. Now this image shows us what the Olympics were supposed to be like when they were initially proposed back in 2008. This was supposed to be a chance for Rio de Janeiro to reinvent itself as a modern global capital. And so this shows this water tower that was supposed to be built on an island off Ipanema, one of the major beaches in Rio, that would function both as a kind of spectacular monument and also as a way of recycling gray water and reusing it in the city's sewage system. Rio has chronic difficulties with sewage. Now this didn't happen. So this is the high-tech, beautiful image of what the Olympics were supposed to bring, not only a kind of triumph of architectural beauty and urban planning, but also a lasting environmental legacy of improvement for Rio. Unfortunately, that's not happening. Sadly, most of the major projects for improving the sustainability, the environmental sustainability, and improving the social inclusion in the city, they're not happening. Instead, the environmental costs are exacerbating some of those chronic environmental difficulties of sustainability in Rio. And we've seen, you've probably seen some of these international reports that the plan to clean Guanabara Bay, for example, to make way for the open water swimming and the yachting events, sadly that did not come to fruition. And it's not because it's impossible. It is quite possible to clean the Guanabara Bay as it's possible to clean the Chesapeake Bay. And there's been tremendous improvements in the Chesapeake Bay over the last generation. Meanwhile, the Guanabara Bay, it has not gotten worse in the past decade, so we can say that. At least it hasn't gotten worse. But it has not notably improved in the last decade either. So the public health and the environmental initiatives to clean the Guanabara Bay, they were very realizable. They could have been realized, but they haven't happened. And they haven't happened because of not so much a failure of planning. The plans are there. It's a failure of political execution. And this goes in part to conflict between the various municipalities around the Guanabara Bay, which include not just the city of Rio de Janeiro itself, but 12 other municipalities around the bay, and the state government, and also the federal government. In 2011, when Olympic planning was at its peak, all of these entities seemed to be riding high. Brazil was booming economically with very high commodity prices, mostly for iron, oil, beef, and soy, which were very high priced on global markets, primarily because of ravenous Chinese demand. The price for all of those commodities has plummeted over the past 4 years. And at the same time, the federal government in Brazil has run into a lot of internal political scandal. So the political and economic picture in Brazil that looked very rosy in 2011 is now looking very difficult. Economically, Brazil is experiencing recession, and it's also experiencing a political crisis at the federal level. And all of that has exacerbated this ability to execute major public health and environmental campaigns in Rio. So now let's look at a little bit about where the Olympics will unfold and some of the complications in each of these sites. This is known as the South Zone of Rio de Janeiro. This is the famous part of Rio de Janeiro. The open water swimming events and the yachting events will happen here off Guanabara Bay, really off of the near South Zone in downtown Rio de Janeiro. Some of the other events happening a little bit farther into the South Zone. The great complication there is that the water is polluted, but full steam ahead. They'll do their best. At this point, there's no possibility of getting it down to satisfactory levels of microbial contamination. But at this point, planners are really just hoping for favorable currents and hoping that things are as clean as possible. Here, this is the North Zone, primarily an industrial or now deindustrializing zone. And part of Olympic planning is to try to diversify this zone economically. So some of the less prominent events are being held there, things like mountain biking, things that you don't even normally associate with the Olympics. But some stadiums and other venues are being built there as a way to try to inject some capital into this area of Rio. There's also a lot of favelas in this neighborhood. So there's been a lot of removals of homes in those neighborhoods to make way for high-speed bus lines and metro lines and some of these Olympic venues. And very similar things apply to that upper zone there, which is in the west zone of Rio de Janeiro, some similar, less prominent events scheduled for there. This is the main Olympic village, and this is in a part of Rio de Janeiro known as Barra da Tijuca. It's actually on the border of Jacarepaguá and Barra da Tijuca. Barra da Tijuca is an upper middle class condominium zone for the most part, but it also does have some favelas that have been there for decades, one of which is right here along this edge of what is going to be the main Olympic village and the site of some of the most prominent venues. And so I've been saying for 7 years now that this favela, and I'll come back to some images of that as we go along, is a bellwether for the Olympics, that the fate of this favela, we can really judge the sustainability and the social inclusion of the Olympics at large by looking at what happens to this favela. And when I initially said that, I was optimistic. I thought that the favela would actually be included and upgraded and improved by the Olympics. There have been plans to remove this favela going back to the early 1980s when it first began to grow. So it's no surprise that there has always been a threat to remove it. But I really thought that urban planners and social activists could turn back those threats and could use the Olympics as an opportunity to upgrade and include this favela more completely in urban life. Sadly, that has not happened, and just in the past week, some evictions have been carried out in this neighborhood. There's been a kind of steady drumbeat of removal either by threat or by force in this neighborhood, and at this point it does look like pretty much everybody who lives there will be driven out of their homes by the time the Olympics rolls around. And now the sad thing about that, well, there are many sad things about it, but one of the sad things about it is that it's now happening too late for anything else to happen in that neighborhood. It's not like they're going to remove it and turn this into an ecologically sustainable park or something like that. No, they'll probably end up just paving it over. Here's a little bit a different view of, this is the municipality of Rio de Janeiro. What you can see from that is an enormous municipality. The parts of Rio de Janeiro that people tend to know about internationally are really clustered right here. So it's a much, much larger municipality than people tend to think of. Some of the things that are happening and related to Olympic planning are creation of high-speed bus lines and metro lines that are linking some of those far-flung areas in the municipality to that core area and to the international airport. The international airport, which is up there where it says Guanabara Bay on the map. Oops, forward a little bit too much. Let me go back one. This map shows you removals from homes in favelas to make way for high-speed bus lines and metro lines and Olympic venues. So anywhere where you see one of those magenta lines, that's where homes have been removed from a favela and people have been resettled to the western zone. So there's a general kind of movement required by the Olympics, or at least being carried out within the Olympics, of former favela residents from the north zone and the south zone to the far western zone to make way for Olympic improvement. It's an Olympic improvement that is leaving them behind. Most of these are being carried out for the highway, the rapid bus transit, and the metro lines, a smaller number being carried out for the Olympic venues themselves. But all told, there's been anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 removals associated with the Olympics. It depends whom you're counting. Almost all of these people have gotten some kind of settlement. So this is not a dictatorship. There has not been violent forced evacuation with no settlement, no subsidy whatsoever. Instead, there's been a negotiated but complicated and unequal process of persuasion blending into coercion. So most people have accepted a low payoff, anywhere from something roughly equal to $5,000 to $20,000 to move out of their home and move to the West Zone. Some of them are being resettled in projects built by the government. Others are getting just a kind of subsidy towards renting a new home or potentially purchasing a new home. Real estate values in the municipality are very high, particularly in the South Zone and any of the core areas of the city. So $5,000 to $20,000 is not anywhere nearly enough to purchase a home anywhere in Rio de Janeiro. Certainly anything in the South Zone would cost comparable to what you'd pay in Annapolis or in various parts of Washington, D.C., for example. We might come back to that one. All right. Here's a close-up of the Olympic Village. This is the beautiful version, and some of this will come to pass. Villa Autódromo, the favela I mentioned, is right there along the western shore of that promontory. You can see it there. Some of it's already been removed in this map, and you can see part of it kind of clustering along the northwestern edge. And so here I'll show you an aerial photograph. This is from a couple of years ago, before those Olympic venues, construction had started on those. And you can see Villa Autodromo in the foreground, a kind of thick cluster of buildings, and then a thinner border stretching along the lagoon there. You hear about drug trafficking in favelas in Rio. There's been a massive security initiative in Rio over the past 5 years, which, like the Olympic planning, initially had some very positive results and has tended to break down in many places over the last couple of years. This is not one of those favelas. This was never a violent favela. It never had a drug trafficking network. In part because it's very small, in part because the favelas of this zone of the city have tended to have different social and economic characteristics. So there's certainly no public security reason to remove this favela. Instead, it's being removed really just to make this area look more beautiful for the Olympic Games, which in my view is a tremendous failure. This was a favela that was ripe for upgrading and inclusion. These are hardworking citizens who are not destitute, they're not impoverished. Even if they were, that would be a reason for upgrading. In this case, though, no, these are working class, even to a kind of upper working class sector of the economic stratification in Rio de Janeiro. This could have been a neighborhood that really would have been a vital part of a diversified Olympic zone. Instead, the mayor is carrying out this forced removal, sadly. This map of Villa Autodromo was initially created as a kind of plan of this could be part of a recipe for inclusion and upgrading. The residents who live there have actually worked closely with architects and urban planners from some of the universities in Rio to work on their own plans for upgrading. And those plans show that this could have been carried out. Sadly, those plans have been ignored by city government. This is a photo just taken last week, and this shows kind of a last-ditch effort by residents to stand firm against orders to evacuate. If you look at this as a legal issue, well, they don't have legal title to their home. So the government does have this power to evict them and resettle them. And none of these people is being resettled without any kind of subsidy. There is an offer on the table for a kind of minimal subsidy. On the other hand, these are people who have been living in their homes for decades, who have poured everything they have earned into those homes. And to wipe that out and to be left with a $5,000 to $20,000 settlement, that destroys basically a lifetime of investment in the home. It also moves them potentially an hour to 2 hours further bus commute from their jobs, and it creates a less diverse and less just city, sadly. I don't want to give you an entirely negative version, so let me focus at least on one positive legacy of the Olympics. And in fact, Rio's mayor has now suggested that this is the most positive legacy of Rio's Olympics, which is in its own way a kind of sad commentary on the failure of some of the other plans to clean the Guanabara Bay, for example. But there has been a beautiful public park created in the North Zone, in this industrial zone, really for the first time. This park, Parque Madureira, which is a long strip which at one point was a railroad and then was running along these public utility towers on the right side. This photo, in fact, is now several years old. Those public utility towers that you see on the right side, they've now been buried underground. So they're no longer visible either. And the park covers both stretches of that green swath there. And it's a very beautiful public park. And this is a huge success of Olympic planning in what remains an underserved area of the city, but previously had no leisure space whatsoever. Much of Rio is close to the beach, but this is an area that's far from the beach, be at least an hour and a half commute by bus from here to the beach. It'll be shorter now that some of these rapid bus transit lines have gone in, but it's still pretty far from the beach. And there really was no public leisure space to speak of in this zone before. So the creation of this very long and well-equipped public park is a legitimate victory, and that will be something that will continue. They're already planning an extension of this farther north, even going beyond the bounds of the municipality of Rio into neighboring municipalities. So in keeping with the emphasis on sports and in the emphasis on branding Rio de Janeiro as this city of fitness and popular celebration, a park like this can be achieved and can make a concrete or a green difference in the city. So I don't want to leave you entirely a negative impression. There are some positive things going on. Overall, however, the picture is one of, I would say, shortcomings of a failure to live up to the initial dreams of the Olympic as an opportunity for environmental sustainability and for social inclusion. So the message that I come back to is that, yeah, as an event, don't worry. If you have an opportunity to go to Rio, get a ticket, go. It'll be great. You'll have a great time. The events will be awesome. Don't go if you're planning to have a child in the next year. But other than that, the Olympics will be great as an event, as an opportunity to remake the city in an environmentally sustainable or socially inclusive way. It's a missed opportunity. And I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
We've got about 15 minutes almost for questions.
Right, I know, yeah. Yeah, great.
I know that during the World Cups, there's so many kind of restrictions as far as restaurants being alcohol, or a certain amount of ratings in stadiums. Will it be the same kind of restrictions as far as around the new stadiums?
No, not to my knowledge. I think that they'll be allowed to sell beer anywhere. I think my understanding is that those restrictions were from FIFA, which has this code that no, you can't sell alcohol at the World Cup. But I don't think that the IOC has those, and I can't imagine them actually being forced in Rio anyway. But
Sir, Mr. Barson, I was just wondering, you said, particularly, I remember you saying the thing with the bay was possible, that it could be done. You can't use that word possibility throughout the presentation. So I'm wondering, like, what happened? Why was it political gridlock, or was it too expensive, or why didn't these things?
yeah, I would say it's political gridlock. Much of the problem is sewage, frankly, and much of that problem comes from the densification of life around the bay. Yeah, there's industrial pollution as well, but the industrial pollution is actually diminished as Rio has deindustrialized over the past generation. Much of the problem comes from sewage, and Rio has the ability to treat sewage. Brazil has the ability to treat sewage and to clean this up. And that has not happened because of political gridlock and because of these falling economic fortunes over the past several years. Yeah. Thank you. That's an excellent question, an excellent point. Is there an Olympic curse? And you bring up the very important comparisons of, you said Beijing and Sochi and Qatar? Yeah. So in terms of social inclusion, Rio will be better than Beijing or Sochi. But, you know, is that what you really want to compare yourself to? Authoritarian regime? No. This was an opportunity in a democratic city for something much better. So the amount of forced removals being carried out, it's nothing in comparison with, well, I shouldn't say it's nothing, but it's not the same number that happened in Beijing, and it's not with the same kind of violence that happened in Sochi, for example. But it shouldn't be. This is a democratic city that should have a much more participatory process in this. Similarly with Qatar, yes, Rio Olympics will look better than giving the World Cup to Qatar, but that's a very low bar. And I do think that this will mark a watershed in Olympic planning. And maybe that'll be the true legacy of the Rio de Janeiro 2016 Olympics, that after this, nobody will want to host it. And so it won't be hosted in the same way in any democratic city again. Instead, maybe it'll mark a reversion to a kind of Barcelona model of 1992. You know, we'll go back a whole generation in a style of Olympic planning that is a little bit more inclusive and that features somewhat more sustainable urban planning and less a focus on the marketable short-term branding. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's also an excellent question. And there you do get to some of these questions of the Olympic curse, and is it worthwhile to spend all this money hosting the Olympics when it's going to be over in 2 weeks? What are the economic benefits of this, even in the short term, much less the medium term? Well, the bus rapid transit lines and the metro lines that are being built for the metro, those are controversial because they do involve favela removal, but I do see them as an investment in the economic mobility of the city. I think that they will be a positive outcome, sadly achieved with some unnecessary social cost to it. But those will contribute to medium-term economic viability. Certainly in the short term, there's a shot in the arm of all of the money being spent to build these venues, to build the bus rapid transit lines and the metros. And then there'll be that economic shot in the arm of tens of thousands of tourists coming for the Olympics. That'll dissipate pretty quickly. So in terms of longer term economic effects, I do think that there'll be some growth that we can point to as a result of improved transportation. But all in all, this tends to get folded in with greater economic diversification of the municipality of Rio in general. Yeah, question back there?
So, Jim McCann, I was wondering more in regard to the culture of the favelas, with if someone going down there, what the people there are like as far as like inclusion or distrust of outsiders, and you know, there's always the things that you said with crime as to whether or not a realistic threat to specifically target people that enter or whether they're more welcome.
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So I've lived in Rio 5 or 6 years, been there dozens of times. I have actually never been successfully mugged. I can't believe I'm saying that because I'm going to jinx myself, but I've had a couple of close calls, but it's never completely been successfully carried off. And look at me, you know, you can't look more gringo than I do. So, I think that, you know, foreigners are not such a target as we might be led to believe by some international media reports. In general, the favelas are, people who live in the favelas are very happy to receive outsiders. Yeah, there's been a lot of violence in and around neighborhoods like that over the past, really since the mid-1980s because of cocaine trafficking, and then police crack down on cocaine trafficking in a way that exacerbates violence. During the Olympics, certainly none of that will be happening. There will be a huge security presence that will reduce that to a bare minimum. So during the Olympics, what you'll see is pickpocketing. There's no way to eliminate that, and that is itself a very deeply admired local sport in Rio de Janeiro. And so you just got to protect yourself the best you can. But it's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's also a really good question. Some of these facilities are destined to be white elephants. There's no popular velodrome cycling in Rio. People in Rio like to ride their bikes along the beachfront promenade, but there's not much of a culture of competitive cycling, and certainly not in bicycle stadiums. So the bicycle stadium is not going to serve any purpose in the future. And there's a number of smaller venues like that. Some of them I think will be used. Like I said, it is a sports crazy city, and there is a demand for sporting facilities like the improved aquatic facility, like the improved basketball and volleyball facilities. So those I think will have a positive but limited legacy. Will people move back? Yes. Historically, people who get removed from favelas, some percentage of them finds a way to move back to the same neighborhood. Now, in cases like some of these favelas that have been, a whole swath has been cut through them for a high-speed rail line, there's no way to move back and set up a house where they used to live. But history suggests that many will find a way to move back and live in another nearby favela. So this is a historical precedent that suggests one of the reasons why favela removal tends to be not really very productive as a strategy of urban planning. Historically, it has not worked. It tends really to lead to short-term removal and then recurrence, regrowth in the same location or growth of other favelas elsewhere. Yeah.
So first question, looking at the building of the venues, that would definitely have an impact on the place, like ecological stability. What are they going to do to counteract, or like afterwards, are they trying to control, like during the Olympics, doing more excess trash and waste for that going in there?
In the short term, there'll be a lot of efforts just to limit trash, and there'll be a lot of these kind of baffles set up in the bay to cut off some of the sources of that trash where it floats into the bay. They'll put up some of these styrofoam buoys to prevent that from flowing farther out into the bay. And so there'll be some short-term remediation efforts that will temporarily make it look better. Some of the photos that you might have been seeing of things like mattresses floating in the bay, you're probably not going to see that in the last couple of weeks right before the Olympics. But the deeper microbial contamination is more complicated. They'll try to bring that down, but again, the fact that it's winter will help a little bit. So water temperatures will also be lower. Microbial levels will tend to be a little bit lower just because of that. It'll look like, hey, we've made a lot of progress in the last 6 months just because it's colder. Yeah. Of course, you know a lot more about things like that than I do.